If you're seeking the ideal artifacts and weapons for building Wriothesley, you're in the right place. In this video, we'll dive into his build while occasionally touching on his kit's mechanics. However, if you're interested in his team composition or a detailed breakdown of his abilities and constellations, be sure to visit the link in the description. That said, let's get started with the stat roadmap. Wriothesley's relevant damage scales on his attack stats, so gaining as much attack stats as you can through weapons and artifacts is preferable. A target of approximately 1800 attack is a good baseline. However, this should only be the priority next to your crit stats. The crit rate you need will vary wildly at around 30 to 90% depending on artifact set and team comp. If you're using the optimal artifact set, around 30% to 40% critical rate should be plenty. We'll talk more about this once we get to the artifact set portion of this video. But generally, you want to focus more on his crit damage over the crit rate stats. 150% crit damage is a good starting point, but you really want to get this as high as possible. Lastly, Wriothesley's elemental burst has a pretty quick cooldown of 15 seconds. And ideally, you want to be able to cast it on every rotation. So having a good amount of energy recharge is also welcome. Considering that it costs 60 energy to cast, which is relatively easy to accumulate, you don't need too much ER. If your team has double cryo characters, the base 100% ER should suffice. Just ensure that Wriothesley gets the elemental particles generated by your team's battery. If you run him as the sole cryo unit in your team, around 120 to 140% ER is the sweet spot. You can even manage with just the base 100% if you have characters wielding weapons from the Favonia series in your team. Having a couple of elemental mastery stats is also not bad if you plan to use Wriothesley in a reverse melt team. But it's not essential if you plan to use him on any other team setup. If you're finding this video valuable so far, consider leaving a like to support the channel. Your support means a lot and is much appreciated. Wriothesley excels as your primary on-field DPS, making it ideal to invest in all three of his talents. But if you lack some resources to level up his talents, you can focus more on his normal attack and elemental skill talents and leave his elemental burst at level 6 temporarily. Give top priority to his normal attack talent, as this can also improve Wriothesley's Rebuke vaulting fist damage. At C0, Wriothesley gets the Gracious Rebuke if his HP is below 60%, which provides various improvements on his special charged attack. It enhances its damage, removes the stamina cost, and heals Wriothesley by 30% of his max HP. Unfortunately, Wriothesley's elemental skill only boosts his normal attack. While the elemental skill can aid in increasing normal attack damage, the most significant improvement comes from leveling up his normal attack talent. A good approach is to level them both alternatively or prioritize on his normal attack, at least until it gets to level 8. For the artifact set, Wriothesley Hunter is optimal for Wriothesley. He can easily take advantage of its set effect and synergize exceptionally well with his playstyle. This set is beneficial in reducing the crit rate requirements for an optimal build. With 3 stacks, it can grant Wriothesley up to 36% crit rate, and you can consistently obtain the full stack simply by performing normal attacks during the duration of his elemental skill. As mentioned earlier, the ideal crit rate is around 30 to 40% depending on your team comp. If you have 2 cryo units in your team, you will get an additional 15% crit rate when hitting frozen enemies or are affected by cryo through the elemental resonance. With the resonance enabled, your upper limit for crit rate is 49%, which translates to 100% crit chance when hitting enemies with the cryo application. This could be even lower if you plan to use Rosaria in your team. On the other hand, 64% is the upper limit if you don't plan on using double cryo in your team comp. Aiming for a crit rate of approximately 40% is a safe and balanced target, whether you intend to employ cryo resonance or not. Speaking of the Freeze team, the Blizzard Strayer set can be a compelling alternative for Wriothesley. This set will provide Wriothesley up to 40% crit rate boost if you're hitting frozen enemies, and Wriothesley can reliably trigger the freeze reaction, especially if you team him up with characters like Yelan, Sing Cho, and, potentially, the upcoming Archon character, Fiorina. It's crucial to remember that certain boss enemies are immune to being frozen. Also, some monsters may have innate elements, making triggering the freeze elemental reaction challenging. Lastly, Shatter will trigger most of the time when using his charged attack, which may remove the extra crit from the set. However, you can still get the base 20% crit rate boost for enemies affected by the cryo element. And since Wriothesley is a catalyst weapon user, his normal attacks can infuse cryo into enemies, albeit slightly hindered by ICD. Nevertheless, you can consistently rely on the 20% crit rate bonus from the set's effect for most encounters. In cases where you can trigger freeze consistently, it will have a slight advantage over the Wriothesley set, especially on the elemental burst damage. Having said that, it's not a bad idea to consider the crit rate you might lose if you can't trigger freeze. For the two-piece alternatives, a good combination is the Wriothesley and Blizzard Strayer two-piece set. You can also combine the Blizzard Strayer or Wriothesley with either the Echoes, Shimenawa, or Gladiator sets. These two-piece combinations have pretty similar damage output at only about a 3% difference. However, you will have higher crit rate requirements of around 60% or more. Other alternatives include the 4-piece Vermilion Hereafter and Shimenawa's Reminiscent sets. These sets could outperform the 2-piece alternatives by around 7%. However, they also demand higher crit rate stats compared to using the Wriothesley set, making them less optimal for Wriothesley. And unless you already possess these sets with excellent substats, actively farming for them may not be the most practical choice. For the main stats, the optimal combination includes attack percent on the sands, cryo damage for the goblet, and either crit rate or crit damage on the circlet. On a reverse melt team, using an EM sands will give you about 7 to 8% better overall average damage than attack sands. However, you will lose about 20% drop-off in average damage when you're not triggering the reaction. Choosing an attack percent goblet can still be viable if you have exceptionally good stat rolls. Compared to an identical stat roll with a cryo goblet, you may experience a roughly 3% reduction in charged attack damage and an approximately 8% decrease in average normal attack damage. However, you will also lose about 19% of elemental burst damage. But then again, elemental burst is only about 20% of Wriothesley's damage contribution. This makes the trade-off somewhat acceptable in specific scenarios, especially if your overall stats are significantly better with the attack goblet. The optimal substats for Wriothesley are crit damage, crit rate, attack percent, and energy recharge. As mentioned earlier, you don't need a high crit rate stat using the Blizzard Strayer or Wriothesley set. Just ensure that you have at least 30% to 40% critical rate, and then prioritize obtaining critical damage or attack percent on your substats to maximize your damage potential. Getting some energy recharge is also okay, so you can cast his elemental burst in every rotation. But you can get by with just the base ER, especially if you have 2 cryo units in your team, or have someone using the Favonius weapon. Elemental Mastery should take priority over ER if you plan to use him on a reverse melt team. Wriothesley's signature weapon, the Cash Flow Supervision, is undoubtedly the most optimal choice for his playstyle. It's about 9% stronger than the nearest 5-star option in terms of normal attack average damage. And even more so if you consider the bonus attack speed and other relevant damage, like his special charged attack and elemental burst damage. However, if you're an F2P player, it's a bit riskier to try for this weapon than getting his first constellation. For context, his first constellation will also improve his damage potential by enhancing the damage and the frequency of casting his special charged attack. The Tulaitula's Remembrance is a pretty good alternative. It works well with Wriothesley's playstyle and could give him up to a 48% boost on his normal attacks. It's the only other 5-star weapon that can give attack speed for Wriothesley, and although its bonus critical damage is lower than other weapons, it compensates with its high base attack, which Wriothesley can capitalize on. The Memory of Dust can also be viable if you plan to use a shielder in your team. Although this weapon offers attack percent for its stats, you have lower crit rate requirements if you use his optimal artifact set. However, this weapon can be somewhat restrictive in terms of your team comp options. The Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds is another excellent option. It boasts a high crit rate, enabling you to concentrate mainly on crit damage and attack stats. You can get at least 2 stacks from its effect in a single rotation, and even more if you have unlocked his C1. Much like the Memory of Dust, the Skyward Atlas features attack as its main stat. However, the Skyward Atlas provides a damage boost without any team composition restrictions thanks to its weapon effects. It also has a high base attack, on par with Cashflow Supervision and Tulatella, which is the highest among the Catalyst weapons. Other good 5-star alternatives are the Tome of the Eternal Flow and Kagura's Verity. Eternal Flow offers impressive crit damage stats to help amplify Wriothesley's overall damage. But the HP boost from its weapon effects does not contribute to Wriothesley's damage. Nonetheless, Wriothesley can capitalize on the charged attack damage boost, granting a substantial 42% bonus. It is especially good if you have Wriothesley at C1, as it allows you to do charged attack more frequently. On the other hand, Kagura's Verity has a slightly higher base attack than Eternal Flow, but also offers a lesser crit damage boost. Unfortunately, Wriothesley cannot take advantage of the weapon's effect at all. Despite that, it could still outperform many other 4-star alternatives, thanks to its crit damage boost and high base attack. But compared to the 5-star weapons I've mentioned so far, its damage output is among the lowest. The 1000 Floating Dreams is a good one if you're using Wriothesley in a melt team. Looking explicitly at melt damage, it can outperform even his signature weapon, but its performance would be worse than even some 4-star options if you're not triggering reverse melt consistently. Among the 4-star weapons, the Widsith is a strong choice for Wriothesley, particularly in a reverse melt team. On this team, Wriothesley can take advantage of all 3 of its random buffs, allowing it to outperform even 5-star weapons. However, if you're aiming for different elemental reactions, such as the freeze reaction, you can only utilize 2 of the 3 buffs. The odds are still pretty favorable, but your DPS can significantly decrease if you don't obtain the attack or elemental damage buff. The Solar Pearl Battle Pass weapon is another strong choice due to its high crit rate stats. If you have this weapon and are using the Marashasi set, you can emphasize boosting your crit damage stats more. Additionally, its weapon effect complements Wriothesley's playstyle well. Among the craftable weapons, Flowing Purity is a solid option. While its attack bonus may be relatively lower, it compensates with its weapon effect, boosting Wriothesley's elemental damage. And you can pretty much clear the Bond of Life by using Wriothesley's special charged attack. However, this will hinder Wriothesley from recovering the full 30% HP from Rebuke Vaulting Fist. The new event weapon, Ballad of the Boundless Blue, is another strong choice primarily because of its weapon effect. Despite being an ER weapon, the effect can stack up to 3 times, providing Wriothesley with a substantial 48% normal attack damage and 36% charged attack damage boost at R5. Stacking its effect is relatively straightforward with Wriothesley, and the ER can be beneficial for maintaining elemental burst uptime. Plus, it's an event weapon, so you can easily refine it to level 5. Mappa Mare could be a decent alternative weapon if you plan on a reverse melt team for Wriothesley. If you only look at the reverse melt damage, it could have a slightly higher damage output than the Cashflow Supervision. But due to ICD, you can't trigger reverse melt on every hit, so its performance is pretty inconsistent. Not to mention, opting for this weapon is very restrictive on your team building. The Blackcliff Agate is also a good choice for its crit damage stats, mainly when dealing with mobs. At R5, it has the potential to outperform even some 5-star options, provided you can maintain 3 stacks of its weapon effect. But your damage will significantly fall if you're up against boss monsters. The Twin Nephrite could be a great starter weapon if you're just starting out. You can easily acquire it from chests and outperform a few 4-star weapons with non-relevant stats. And that concludes our Wriothesley's Build Guide. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. And if you're looking for more videos like this, check out these recommended content next.